Any confidential reports?
Somehow the Japs must have known we were coming. Nevertheless, the dive bombers were just starting their run and we went right on in.
Why do women make good welders, sir?
Well, I think it's because they have better nerves than men. In welding, muscle helps, but you've got to have those nerves too.
So the women that built the aircraft and ferried them, the men who flew them at the time, we continue to salute as you see that beautiful P-38 climb high in the sky with the sound of those beautiful Allison engines. This aircraft purrs as we have moved the hands of time now to Operation Vengeance, the American military operation to kill Admiral Yamamoto of the Imperial Japanese Navy, April 18, 1943. During the Solomon Islands campaign in the Pacific theater of World War II, Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy, was killed when his transport bomber aircraft was shot down by United States Army Air Force fighter aircraft operating from Kukum Field in Guadalcanal. The mission, based on U.S. Navy intelligence, gave away the itinerary in the Solomon Islands for the general, or the admiral. The death of Yamamoto reportedly damaged the morale of Japanese naval personnel, raised the morale of the Allied forces, and was intended as revenge by U.S. leaders who blamed him for the attack on Pearl Harbor. After the war, there was debate over which of the U.S. fighter pilots involved in the raid deserved the official credit due to conflicting first-hand reports from the participants. But what is known is that it was the P-38 Lightning, the aircraft chosen to carry that mission out. Easily one of the most recognizable fighters of the time because of its distinctive twin boom design. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was one of the most famous American warplanes of the war. The mount of America's two top aces, Dick Baum, who scored 40 aerial victories, Tommy McGuire, who was credited with 38. However, although more than 10,000 Lightnings were built during the war, the fighter did not fit into the Air Corps post-war plans and was soon retired from service. Today, there are probably fewer than a score of intact Lightning airframes left in the world, and only about a half dozen of those flyable or even restorable to flying condition. This aircraft belongs to the Planes of Fame Air Museum's collection, the object of a 13-month restoration project by Steve Hinton's fighter rebuilders crew at Chino and the Planes of Fame volunteer workers, the P-38 Lightning. Rotating propellers and no torque, centrally concentrated fighter power, twin engine safety, hydraulically boosted ailerons and range. The P-38 was America's first truly modern military aircraft. On the strafing run, the P-38 Lightning. Maximum speed, 414 miles per hour, 1,425 horsepower in those two Allison V12 piston engines. Richard Baum, as I mentioned, America's highest scoring ace, flew the P-38, as did Thomas McGuire. Also, Charles Lindbergh flew it in the Pacific. And meanwhile, over in Europe, the author of The Little Prince and so many other wonderful flying stories, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, flew this airplane, the P-38. Flying the airplane for us today is Steve Hinton, one of the most qualified and respected warbird pilots in the world today. He and his crew have done a masterful job of keeping this airplane aloft so that we will never forget the sacrifices and the stories we're telling you today. Now taking to the sky, more of the aircraft of the war in the Pacific. The very rare Dauntless. The TBM Avenger. This parade of aircraft will tell the rest of the story as we culminate with the bombings of Japan from the B-29 that you will see take off shortly as we recover the B-38. And our Navy version of the B-25 gets ready to taxi in front of you. The Dauntless will lead the way in just a moment. The Douglas SBD Dauntless Dive Bomber. The bomber that won the Battle of Midway will begin this series of passes with these iconic Navy planes. Ladies and gentlemen, stand by for the sound of round. The big round engine of the Dauntless. The larger round engine coming in of the Avenger. And then even more horsepower above from the Corsair as they make their own music right now. And as the iconic airplanes fly by, taxiing in front of you right now, please give them a wave of appreciation. Steve Hinton, the crew of our Navy version of the B-25 again as we start to gather them up and continue to tell our story and move the hands of time forward. This time, ladies and gentlemen, the Douglas SBD Dauntless Dive Bomber. 1,200 horsepower right radial engine, pulling that airplane through the sky, 255 miles per hour. The TBM Avenger from Planes of Fame. With a right radial engine, 1,900 horsepower, maximum speed 275 miles an hour, and above that, the Corsair. Maximum speed 446 miles an hour. The Pratt & Whitney Double Wasp Twin Row 18-cylinder, 21 horsepower, air-cooled radial aircraft engine, part of the long-lived Wasp family as these Navy planes continue to fly in front of us now. The Dauntless dive bomber leading the way. The plane won midway, so many have said. Followed by the Avenger, which entered service in 1942. First saw action during the Battle of Midway, despite the loss of 5 of the 6 Avengers on its combat debut. It survived in service to become one of the most outstanding torpedo bombers of World War II. Greatly modified after the war, remaining in service into the 60s. The Avenger now on stage to your left. The aircraft that future President George H.W. Bush was commissioned as the youngest naval aviator at the time to fly. Later, while flying that TBM, his Avenger was shot down. However, he released his payload and hit the target before being forced to bail out over water. He later received the Distinguished Flying Cross. Another famous Avenger aviator was actor Paul Newman, who flew as a rear gunner. He'd hoped to be accepted as for pilot training, but did not qualify because he was colorblind. Newman was on board the escort carrier Hollandia, roughly 500 miles from Japan, when the Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb in Hiroshima. The photo pass of the Dauntless dive bomber, ladies and gentlemen. Followed by the Avenger. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, the Navy Corsair. But again, we move the hands of time forward in our presentation as we look back these 75 years since the attack on Pearl Harbor. At this very airbase, a B-29 was landing. In 1945, 509th Composite Group was transferring from its 2nd Air Force Training Base in Utah. The group landed right here at this airport, embarking on its trans-Pacific movement to the Marianas Island chain. Due to the extraordinary secrecy of the unit, because of its atomic payload and mission, the commanding general of Mather Field was told at gunpoint that he was not allowed to board the B-29. The great artiste, you see, was headed across the Pacific with the atomic bomb on board. Our B-29 FIFI takes to the sky as we now get ready for our concluding chapter in the War on the Pacific. Please give a wave to our crew, too, now as we recover these aircraft and launch at the same time the escorts, the P-51 Mustangs, that, yes, saw action in the Pacific Theater as well, although they were very much needed as escorts in Europe. As things wound down there, they were moved, of course, into the Pacific, and we'll tell you more of their story very shortly. But first, the Dauntless, the Avenger, and the Corsair will taxi by. Our escorts will join up with the B-29 Superfortress FIFI, as we gather these iconic Navy planes in front of you now. finally touching down now, the Corsair. As we recover our Navy aircraft, the B-29 turns in, and we are about to begin our final chapter, ladies and gentlemen, 75 years ago.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid many-fold, and the end is not yet.
The end was not yet, but it was near. The second atomic bomb would be dropped, as we know. The aircraft that you see taxiing back in now, again, I would encourage you to wave to our pilots who've decided today that their story is not as important as this story. As we continue to salute 75 years ago, that attack on Pearl Harbor and all that followed. The little friends, the P-51 Mustangs, circle overhead. The P-51 was a relative latecomer to the Pacific Theater due to the legendary or the largely need for the aircraft in Europe, although the P-38's twin-engine design was considered a safety advantage for long overwater flights. The first P-51s were deployed in the Far East later in 1944, operating close support and escort missions, and then, of course, they would be moved along to escort B-29 Super Fortress missions against the Japanese homeland. The Mustang, originally designed to use the Allison engine, in its earlier variants had limited high-altitude performance, first flown operationally by the Royal Air Force, and then that mix of Rolls-Royce and British technology, the Merlin, replacing the later models and increasing the Mustang's performance at higher altitudes. The definitive version, the D models you see flying here, with the Packard license-built version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin two-stage, two-speed, supercharged engine. She was able to pull the aircraft through the sky at more than 400 miles an hour. So, ladies and gentlemen, have your cameras ready now. Gordy Webb of Tora Pyro promises this pass to be most impressive in our theatrical presentation of our war on the Pacific. Ladies and gentlemen, be ready now for the Wall of Fire! And now, ladies and gentlemen, the last chapter in our story.
And hopes of all America, indeed of all the civilized world, are centered tonight on the battleship Missouri. There, on that small piece of American soil, anchored in Tokyo Harbor, the Japanese have just officially laid down their arms. They have signed terms of unconditional surrender. 4 years ago, the thoughts and fears of the whole civilized world were centered on another piece of American soil, Pearl Harbor. The mighty threat to civilization which began there is now laid at rest. It was a long road to Tokyo and a bloody one. We shall not forget Pearl Harbor.
We will not forget. The cost indeed bloody. 420,000 U.S. soldiers dead. 111,914 battle deaths, including 13,395 who died as prisoners of war. 5,707 who died of wounds. 49,000 non-battle deaths. 248,316 wounded. 16,358 captured and returned. It is for those that we dedicate our tribute to the Pacific War this weekend, so that we may never forget their sacrifice. Ladies and gentlemen, we have veterans of the Second World War with us here today. Please make sure by your applause they know that we will never forget their sacrifices. Charged with the incredible responsibility now of bringing the B-29 Super Fortress FIFI back to the ground safely. This very rare bird and all its importance to our history, and that story always be told, continues to fly through the generous donation of members of the Commemorative Air Force and those who choose to ride in the airplane. FIFI, a surviving B-29, one of only two in the world today. Owned again by the Commemorative Air Force, currently based at Vintage Flying Museum located at Meacham International Airport, Fort Worth, Texas. First flown in 1942, began active service in 1944, replacing the B-17s and the B-24s. Carefully now, Jason brings FIFI back to the ground. And ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our salute, our look back 75 years ago, and all that followed that attack on that day of infamy at Pearl Harbor. We hope you've enjoyed our commemoration here with FIFI and all the warbirds that we have not only offered up in the sky, but plenty of others on static display here today.